the opening opposition. Okay, let me call a swing. Let me get a swing team. Yeah, we need a swing team here. Hey. Cool. Okay, we are ready to go. So, Prime Minister, start the debate for us.
Hi, can you hear me?
100%.
All right. Just you said 7:15, right? It's 7:15. You so obviously at 15, right?
It's
All right.
timing.
Allow me just get a timer and something to record. Hey, what's up, Raymond? What's up? I don't want 8 minutes. He said I'll stop listening at like 15, and I was like, hey, at 7, and I was like, all right, Raymond, there is nothing in my DM. I'm not seeing. Okay, I see the laughing emojis now. Let me just like organize my notes. Before that, I will check the POIs in the text space. Yeah, I'll check the POIs in the text space. What else? Yeah, pronouns are he, him. I really don't want to take from OO because like they have two speeches. I'll prioritize CO, but in case OO has a POI, please feel free to take it. All right, Raymond, I will definitely. All right, so I will start my speech. All right, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. So, Pano, we from Opening Government believe in like 3 fundamental things. We believe, 1, in things like freedom. Secondly, we believe in having control over particular consequences that you may actually make. But then I'll like get into all that like cost-benefit analysis and stuff like that. But a bit of characterization, we both know abortion. I can't be saying abortion here and stuff like that. But universal constitutional right. What we think a universal constitutional right necessitates that 1, it's a right that universally where you go, all states in of themselves would then agree to have abortion as a constitutional right. Understand, from a first-year student, I really don't know a lot about law, but I just think constitutional rights are basically like any other normal rights. So like there's no CG can't come and say, oh, constitutional right is very, very important. Or can't come and say constitutional right is very, very important, or CO. So I think, first wait, I've paused my time. You lost me? Like, I lost the speaker. Shit. She says I lost him. So I think it technically means like he can't hear me. Let me try reconnecting and like join.
Okay, guys, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Paul. We can.
I think I was having an.
Yes.
Okay. You're going to restart. I'm going to start your timer.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just start. Do a countdown.
Raymond, remove these things on your. Can I start?
Yeah, you can start.
All right. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel. From OG, I'm going to give you characterization. I'm going to do a setup, and I'll give you our points, and I'll weigh. First thing, abortion. Simply, this is in simple terms, abortive terminating a pregnancy. Should be a universal constitutional right. Universal constitutional right necessarily means that states in and themselves, everywhere in the world, will conclude and agree that like abortion should be a constitutional right. Thirdly, there is nothing special about all constitutional right. We just think what this simply means is like each and every one, like women specifically, because they're the ones who like have the pregnancies, will have the capability to terminate those pregnancies when they don't want those particular pregnancies. That is to say, look at the US. If you move to any particular state, you have the capability to abort, no matter the state you're in and stuff like that. We think that's what's important. That is to say, no team in this debate can come and say, nah, they're not going to. They're like, we didn't explain what a universal constitutional right is. But secondly, we think as government, we have the fiat to make this work. So hope don't come and say universal rights and stuff like that. Yeah, so I think that's the first important thing that you need to understand in terms of characterization. The second thing you need to get on the first idea we have from opening government as to why we believe this should be a constitutional right is that one, society in of itself has been shaped in terms of freedom. That is to say, throughout like the 20th and now the 21st century, there has been a whole, what's this thing we don't hear? I'm going to continue. Can the chair hear me? I've paused my time for a second. Can I continue? Why wait? Pause with the dots.
Okuku.
Yeah.
Okay. In case it's me, I can hear you. In case it's else, that person just needs to reconnect.
All right, cool. So let me continue. I'll continue. I'll stop my timer in 3, 2, 1, go. So, one, we think there has been the notion of freedom. You can call it the principle of freedom. You can call it whatever you want. We think freedom in of itself has been a push factor to the century and the days we live in. Why is this necessarily true? We think on the idea of how, one, you need to free people who are in captivity in terms of freeing prisoners of war. But secondly, how children who are underaged and have got pregnant and are going to be affected by that pregnancy have the capability to what? To be able to abort. Thirdly, the idea in France where right now people are fighting to ensure that the hijab, that Muslim women can still have their hijabs on. Why is this framing important? Things like freedom or bodily autonomy have been at the core century of this particular time that we are in. That is to say, this justifies why we should make it a constitutional right. Because at the end of the day, when we don't make it a constitutional right, we are infringing on people's freedom. Why that becomes harmful, that one, it goes against the notion of freedom which is being preached in the current times that we are in. At that particular point in time where it infringes that, it means you get inconsistency. What's the impact on this? The impact is twofold. In a world necessarily where you don't make it a constitutional right and you've harmed people's freedom, one, get things like social disobedience, where people are unwilling to look at the state because the state is infringing on their rights. Yet the state has been promoting a whole narrative of freedom. This is why even when we're having campaigns in Uganda and like the internet was shut down, everyone elsewhere was preaching freedom. You think the principle of freedom in of itself is at the core of our particular century, and that's why it's something that's necessarily important. But the second thing you get from us that backs this up is on why we're not necessarily ending a life. I don't really want to make this seem like a law thing, but this is understand. One, we think terminating a pregnancy in of itself is not ending a life. Why? Legal personality of subjectivity begins at birth when you're separated from your mother, and even though the umbilical cord is still there. We think in the vast majority of instances, abortion necessarily happens where one, the child is not even born, whereby probably the child is like 2 or 3 months and stuff like that. That is to say, that is when abortion necessarily happens. Why is that important? At the end of the day, you need to understand that one, we're not taking a life because that fetus has no legal personality, has no legal subjectivity, to the sense that it is not protected for. It may be protected in other instances, like probably like in inheritance and what, but I think at the core center of it, it is not a human being and we are not taking its life. We think that's something important. But the third thing to understand is how abortion takes place in many scenarios. In the vast majority of instances, abortion takes place to the core where someone probably has got pregnant because of like having sex and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, they can't necessarily do anything about it. Why is this important? Abortion happens in the vast majority of instances around 3 to 5 months before a child is born. That is to say, at no point are we killing a child, we're simply killing a fetus, which is not of a big problem. The fourth thing, the prejudices which will exist on side opposition are prejudices which exist because of one that like necessarily like are religious prejudices. Why that is not important in this debate is understand. Today's society operates on circularism. That is to say, we have lots of circular courts, and like basically it's like a progressive and a day-to-day thing. Why that is important is that even in the vast majority of instances, a large part of society doesn't believe in notions where you don't give people those particular freedoms of theirs. That is to say, at the end of the day, whatever opposition will give you solely runs on these circular beliefs, which we inherently don't buy, on religious beliefs, which we inherently buy on like circular beliefs. I'll take a POI from side CO. 3, 2, 1. All right. The fourth thing, consequences. Understand. We think why you should make an abortion a universal right is this: states inherently can't control the rate at which people have sex. That is to say, even when they provide condoms, they can't necessarily stop people from having sex. That is to say, you can't prevent them. Why does that become important? States inherently need a mechanism to control consequences in the long run. Consequences like this, in terms of what happens that when people don't abort, you create street children, you create lots of crimes, where you create lots of orphans and a lot of resources that need to be put into state to handle those problems. Understand, this is two arguments. One, on a cost-benefit analysis, it becomes expensive for states to take care of those particular problems. That is why we think you should give this as a universal right. But the third and the second fundamental thing on this argument is how you give states the capability to control consequences and create a controlled environment. Why is that important? It's cheaper for states to make abortion legal rather than in a sense where it is not legal. Because at the end of the day, the ability to control the consequences becomes so important. Because at the end of the day, many of the things or the choices we make, we can't avoid them, and I've been able to show that state can't stop people from having sex or anything like that. And in my last 2 seconds, I want to make it clear that one, controlling the consequences becomes a far fundamental and a better thing on their side from opening government. Freedom, how controlling consequences is something that is fundamentally better, and why we don't end the life. Vote OJ.
Cool. We thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. Let's welcome the leader of the advanced opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. My pronouns are he and him. If you have a POI, please, you can just unmute and ask as opposed to texting the text space, because I may not be reading. Okay. I'll start in 3.
Wait. First, give me a minute. Let me just join my device. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Okay. We are set to go. You can start your countdown.
Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, and then 1. From opening government, we don't get a clear contextualization of how this is going to happen. For example, which body is going to implement this, and how plausible is it? We think we shall just assume for matters of this debate that we have a body like the United Nations, which has the most buy-in from countries and is declaring this some sort of, like we did with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is just one of them that you want to add as part of the Universal Human Rights, right? So that's where we are going to debate from. So panel, one is that we need to understand what is the metric that qualifies a particular right as universally constitutional accepted. One, we think that if it has consensus from all member states, or like the majority, that is to say that we agree, all of us, that individuals should have a freedom from torture, that people should have like a right to life, right? These are things all member states of the UN, or at least majority of them, subscribe to. Understand that bodies like the UN and other international bodies arrive at the decisions because of participation of member states and the capacity that they can vote them and they can go through. We think particularly for this kind of debate for abortion, we do not have that consensus and we do not have that buy-in, and therefore we're not going to have like a universal consensus or even a majority agreeing to this. Secondly, we think that it does not even necessitate being a universal right? We think, for example, it is not true that abortion is equated to the right to life. We think actually in the reverse, we think abortion violates the right to life, right? We think therefore does not meet like the metric or the standard for it to qualify it as an inherent fundamental human right that needs to be declared as universal. Because in the first place, it involves taking of life. There is a debate here which perhaps is going to be what is determined on the idea of whether a baby of 1 week, of 2 months, or even 6 months has a life. It is an argument that those individuals have lives. The argument that these individuals can't self-determine is very stupid, because even in the Human Rights Declaration, the Declaration of Human Rights, even if someone was born dumb with brain malfunction without some body organs, those individuals still have rights to be protected. So the idea that these individuals can't self-determine is not true. But secondly, we think there is a huge burden on government, and we know for sure they can't prove to us that these individuals do not have a life. We think generally the United Nations and generally across the world, there is no consensus. Even scientists have not arrived at a unanimous consensus on whether a young baby does not have life, that a young baby is not a person, right? So we think government in this debate doesn't have even capacity to prove that, because they don't have the scientific or biological knowledge capacity to prove to the panel, right? So we think that nuance is settled, that there is no agreed position and no team can purport to prove that, right? So let us go to the plausibility of whether this can indeed be a universal human right. So we think first it is not plausible. We think that, for example, we think that 70% of Asia, which is dominated by Arab countries, will not accept in the UN or even implement it in their countries. We think highly concentrated countries like Congo, like Uganda, etc., will not accept this right? We think highly African culturalized countries like Zimbabwe will not accept this right? So we think first of all it is not plausible and it cannot be implemented. We think that's very important. But what is the problem with this? We think first of all that the United Nations, even a body equated which has the capacity to implement international rules and regulation, doesn't have capacity to impose these things on these particular countries. We think largely these bodies only thrive because they have buy-in, and large buy-in from majority of the member states. To the point that we show that they do not have this, then we don't think this is plausible, right? We think that is very important. But secondly, that these international bodies need to be careful, because as much as these international bodies, they thrive on the autonomy of individual countries. We think we have had a trend of behavior that the United Nations does not impose itself on matters that have internal contradictions. That is to say that if countries like that, vast majority of Asian countries or African countries have internal discontentment with particular resolutions of the UN where there is no unanimous decisions, they do not go ahead to implement those things, because it is important that as much as these sovereign, these international bodies exist, that the sovereignty of individual countries is upheld. And that is why the UN has been slow on imposing particular regulations in the continents where they are not viable, right? But let us even imagine the worst case scenario. For example, Uganda accepts abortion rights. We think first of all, these countries, even when they accept, they're not going to have buy-in from the populations. Look at, for example, how the anti-gay and homosexuality bill was contested by the entire population and the people's representatives to parliament. We think because there's a natural consensus. We exist in countries where religious institutions have a lot of influence on those societies, and why we believe we have highly concentrated religious cultures and African traditions which do not believe in abortion. We think you're not likely to get buy-in even from these individual countries. And what do countries do when they don't have the populations on their side? They're able not to sign those they're able not to be signatories to those policies that can even opt out of the UN. We think the ripple effect is to weaken those international bodies, but also have most of the countries not consenting to signing most of these declarations. We think that is very important. But let us also have an engagement on what is the effect on the economy, like these people are arguing that you have street kids. We think it is worse from their side. Let us show you how. First and foremost, when you say that this is a universal right, that a girl can have sex and they can abort as they want. Okay, ask your POI.
Lowell, you know it, even in the law of dialect around the whole world, when you kill a baby, it's not considered as a person. They only charge you for damages to the mother. So stop telling us that it's not there. At the end of the day, the fetus has no life.
Oh, wow. We think clearly you have a limited understanding of the law, but that's excusable because this is not moot, it is entirely debate. We think we have vast majority of countries which have laws against abortion because they believe that these babies' life should be preserved, right? We think that is plausible, right? So it does not have necessarily to amount to murder, right? But it is abortion, it is killing a person, right? And we think even then, like we said, it is a nuance in this debate that there is no agreed positions by scientists on whether a baby has life or not, right? We think that is important, right? But let us continue on the argument of the economics because they argue that you have street kids. At the point where you say that everyone can abort when they want, you open the floodgates. We tell you that you're going to have that we need to think that the medical care that is required to treat a single woman and 1,000 women who have aborted is very costly on individual economies. We think that developing countries like Africa, like Uganda, etc., do not have capacity to maintain these particular healthcare systems. We live at a time when even these like funders have reduced their funding to HIV, and that is why you have had increase. Like because they have been hit by COVID and the Ukrainian war, they do not have the luxury of continuing to finance health ministries and health sectors of developing countries. So what you're going to have is that you have countries already poor with street kids having to sort of deal with the increased levels of HIV and all these things that outweigh our healthcare system, and you have to take care of thousands of women who have aborted. These countries do not have that capacity. We beg to rest our case.
Thank the opposition for that fine speech. Let's welcome the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Cool. Is my sweet voice audible? I'm not sure if it's sweet at the moment because I'm kind of sick, but is it? Oh, it is. All right. All right, cool. So I'm going to take points of information in the text space. Don't badger at any point. Oh, wait. In fact, badger. You just ask once. Don't do like what James was doing when Laura was speaking. You just ask once. You just unmute once, and I will know that someone wants it to. Right? I'll take both benches. I have no preferred gender pronoun. Whatever you prefer to call me, he, she, they. I really don't mind. Let's go. Right, starting the next 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Speaker, we think Lawe literally has a misunderstanding of what it means to abort in the first place. When you go to the airport and they say abort that plane from taking flight, it means it hasn't yet taken into the air. When you say abort someone from going outside, is not yet outside. When you say abort that baby from being born, it means he or she literally does not have life in him or her yet. This is why the process of pregnancy literally exists in the first place. That is, say, at the point in time when that baby does have life, you are now it is now restricted from you killing it. But at a point in time when people literally are going to abort early, and this and that is beneficial to these individuals, we think you're not going to affect anything at all. So there isn't any life that is literally going to be taken away. 3 things that you're going to get specifically from this speech. Firstly, I'm going to do a bit of case rebuilding since Lawe was literally ignorant of the entirety of James' sophisticated speech. Secondly, some direct rebuttals to the inadequate arguments that we get from Lawe. 2 things, which was like the evaluation of how this world is likely to look like, and secondly, the idea about life. Thirdly, I'm going to extend on 2 points of substantive, which is most likely going to take closing government out of this debate because they won't have any extensions. Let's begin. The first thing that James tells to you is he shows you exactly what this world literally looks like. Because it's an evaluation debate, this debate needs to be interrogated on what the principles are most likely going to look like and how you can relate them to the practicality itself. Why? Because at a point in time when you decide to ensure that we create a model and show you exactly how this is most likely going to lose, we think opening government and closing government are most likely not going to have a debate. Because like it or not, how countries literally identify when it comes to consensus decision and when it comes to universal decision is something that is literally relative and subjective to their own gain. What we need to prove to you from opening government is exactly what are the consequences that exist within humans and how best can we limit and eradicate a certain type of consequences and how can we ensure that there can be prosperity within that society. This is exactly what James' speech was literally centered on. The first thing he tells you was why freedom is essential and how you harm that freedom when you decide not to create a universal picture in it. responding to what we get from Lawel in the first place of what he talks about consensus decision, yes, the idea here is even if laws in different countries and different states are always going to be different, what is always going to exist there is a principle that you literally need to protect. We think freedom goes from as far to Zimbabwe, where individuals who are bought are not going to be allowed, to the American society, where it has now been allowed. The idea here is that freedom that you're most likely going to take away from people, how are you likely going to be affected? You need to implement more structures in order for you to protect that law. Secondly, you need to ensure that like the structures that you're then going to inherit are individuals that you're making more aware and you're making them more skeptical. At a point in time when you then when you then make like individuals having like a hard time in gaining that certain type of freedom, we think you harm the type of principles that people surround them, because the type of relationships and the type of circulations that exist in that society when it comes to people wanting sex or when it comes to people having irrational decisions is something that you clearly throw out of the matter, because these are things that make individuals humans, and like it or not, you can ever eliminate these problems at all. And when you think, when you then make it hard for people to engage within these like certain type of structures, you're then harming that freedom more and more, and you really don't think there's any benefit in principle for you to do this. Second argument that literally came from like Lawe was the idea of life. Understand exactly how we literally going to take this above them. The first thing that I'm going to argue here is like the even if analysis. Taking life is already illegal in each and every country. This is the reason why there are stages where you can abort and there are stages where you cannot abort. At a point in time when you're going to abort at that stage, that is literally made in and itself, and you don't really think that's the word we support. The word that opening garment support is when you then decide to abort during the early stages of pregnancy, when you're able to notice it and there isn't any form of life at all. That is exactly what abortion is, because you're eliminating the chance of that embryo ever having life at all. So we don't really think in our world you're taking life. But secondly, even if you're taking life, we already talked to you about how when that stage literally is going to be reached, you're still going to be tagged with murder and all that. So we think our world is still protected because we protect the inherent aspect of what it means to be aborting. I think that's all that came from him. Let's move on to the substantive. The first thing that you need to understand is exactly how humans like literally exist. Humans exist with rationality, and how the rationality of them puts them in consequences. What this then means is that there are always going to be consequences with actions that are going to be taken by humans. How best can you eliminate or limit those consequences from happening? Because when people abort, there are certain type of reasons that surround this. Whether the mother might not be able to take care of the child, secondly, people might not want the child at all because they've engaged within unprotected sex or didn't decide to use contraceptives at all. These are the consequences that come with you being human. That irrationality is something that we can never take away. But something that we can solve and eradicate is the type of consequences that come with you engaging within those activities. We don't really think at a point in time when you decide to make it hard for these individuals to eliminate these consequences, you then make it hard for individuals to have one, a society where they can better actualize within their youth, or second, even individuals who are in the old ages because they can take care of the baby, actualize based within that old age. You then take away that principle of self-actualization and you don't think there's any peace that comes from it. Secondly, there is a power that exists within the law. That power ensures that you're already like evaluating each and every aspect that exists within the society to see whether the principle you're going to defend is one that is going to affect the majority or is one that is going to affect the minority. When we talk about Generation Z, it has a lot of capability. That is to say, it has a lot of consequences. And those consequences, when you then decide to evaluate it, because you want to talk about how international bodies literally exist without interrogating those principles, you're most likely going to harm those people. Lastly, let's talk about accountability and exactly how you're better to sustain like a better life within the society. The first thing is like we can never account for all harms that we can literally create when it comes to the consequences that comes within pregnancy and unwanted pregnancy. But the best thing that we can do is sustain the aftermath that is going to come when it comes to abortion. At a point in time when you see exactly how the process of aborting something one that is expensive and is painful, is like you're most likely going to have that ideas of how you're going to be protecting the decision that you're most likely going to have. You will now have like you now have sex that is now protected. you now like literally be skeptical in what you're most likely going to do. So we think this is, in our world, we create a better principle in protecting the Generation Z that most likely exists. But secondly, what we do in practicality is we create a world which we account for the harms and limit those harms in ever existing. Proud to propose.
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech. Let's welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition here.
Confirm if I can be heard. Can anyone hear me?
You're audible. You can start.
Okay, I'll be beginning in 2, 3. Okay, so guys, if you want to raise a POI, kindly raise. I will not be checking the chat space. Okay. So I'll begin my speech in 2, 3, 1. So, Chair, I want to draw context in this debate on analyzing on why it is important for us to have a universal right, a universal constitutional right that provides for abortion in and of itself. Notice 2 things, Chair. A, that not having a universal constitutional right does not mean that other countries that want to adopt such a right cannot adopt it. Or that is to say that countries hold the power to make it a constitutional right or not, depending on what their kind of buy-in is, without necessarily making it universal. So the kind of arguments that you get from government seem to presume the fact that we need to have it, because if we don't have it as a universal constitutional right, certain countries are they're not okay, that other people are not going to be able to abort necessarily because of that. Now B, I'll be engaging on why it is important for us to leave it to the countries what the alternative is in essence. Why should we leave it to the countries to decide on whether or not it becomes a constitutional right or not? 3 things under that. I talk about the sovereignty of these countries. Notice, Chair, Lawel told you that international bodies benefit from the very buy-in of other countries. That is to say that international bodies do not have rights in a world where these countries do not choose to like subscribe to them, A, B, and C like that, right? So we need, after understanding that, you need to understand that countries hold that power to necessarily buy out in certain things that they do not want. But okay, on the vast majority, what is the likelihood of us having countries agree to the fact that indeed, you guys, we can equate the right to abortion as much as the right to life? We think that as far as team opening government cannot present that kind of case, we think then they cannot provide to us a case that you see, guys, it is as important, like abortion is such a intrinsic good that we cannot do without or survive without, right? So what do you need to understand in this debate? We need to understand the consequences that we're going to have after accepting or after making it a universal right in and of itself. 3 things. On the government in itself. So, Chair, understand that we have a lot of countries, like Nawel has discussed, countries like the Asian countries that may not necessarily buy into some of these things. Notice how countries are formed also on communal beliefs. Understand, Chair, that countries such as the Asian countries that are made on those communal beliefs may not necessarily buy into certain things such as abortion, and regardless of what, they would still protect that. Now that has an effect on how effective international bodies become in essence. Yes, we can argue that if you don't want, you can buy out, you can impose sanctions. But at a point in time when everyone is buying out, we think then the international bodies lose that kind of sustainability. They would have to impose certain important things within the world in and of itself. The second thing you need to understand, the second thing you needed to understand is the aspect of sustainability, right? Notice, Chair, that most other, like in the world today, most countries are suffering. Like we're suffering, we cannot even sustain our HIV people. We still have kids on the streets. Now we're going to add a burden of abortion, women that have aborted simply because it is a universal right, and we in essence have to like make it. So when we make it universal, we open floodgates like anyone would necessarily. First of all, it is an incentive. Oh, I'll go and have sex and have a child that I can abort anytime, any day. We think that even if that wasn't the case, we think that the countries, it is important for us to have these countries maintain the right to either make it a constitutional right or not a constitutional right, to avoid a kind of backlash that weakens international bodies that are in essence actually very probable and important for us to pass important information to the world, right? So what do we get from opening opposition in this sense? Taken.
Okay, in countries where abortion is legal, how many of these countries are struggling with cases of abortion?
Yeah. Understand that what this means, it means that even in countries where it is illegal and they cannot actually sustain, they are then forced to sustain even when they cannot, and we think that is essentially harmful. And in countries where it is legal, well and good for them because they can sustain. But if you make it a universal right, the effect it has is that the country has no opt-out mechanism. It must provide for them. And we think that is very dramatic and bad for the economies because they're already struggling with many other things, right? So reasons as to why we think this is a bad idea. First, now I told you that it does not even meet the metric of being universal. They cannot prove to you that all countries within the world are going to necessarily agree, or at least a bigger fraction are going to agree that, you see, guys, a right to life is equivalent to a right to abortion. Or that is to say, they cannot prove to you that abortion is such a intrinsic right that we cannot do without. So necessarily, I've told you, the alternative is to leave it to the countries to own their laws, to make their laws, their body, their autonomy as countries is also very important and crucial in this debate. The second thing is their practicability that we talked about. We told you Asian countries, we told you Texas, countries such as Texas, they're not going to buy into such things, and that is very problematic on the international bodies. And I've showed you how the ripple mechanism is also bad for other important things, right? So, and then you look at the kind of backlash that you're going to have within the society and in the countries. Now, what does opening government tell you? Opening government tells you, see, we need freedom. Now, this is how even freedom is limited in their side of the house. You limit the freedom of the countries to be able to make their own laws because you subject them to a universal and continental kind of law that A, they don't believe in, that B, they get some sort of backlash from their society. So we think that even the aspect of freedom to that very extent is limited on the grounds of countries. And we think that it is important that if countries can set referendums in their own states and have people's opinion, it is then better than us forcing onto them and having them with no option. We think even the aspect of freedom is more limited within their side of the house. The aspects on whether or not is taking a life, they cannot prove, and there is no scientific basis that shows you that a fetus is not alive or it is not alive. So we cannot have a discussion on that point because then it becomes a level ground. On the consequences on whether or not parents can take care of these pregnancies, all those arguments can be held by countries deciding on whether or not they actually believe that abortion should be a right, but not us imposing it as a universal constitutional right, because it has dire effects on how these countries get to be run. It has dire effects on their sovereignty because they have to buy into things they don't believe in, but it has dire effects on the nature of international relations and international bodies and how they eventually get to affect other important policies. We rest our case.
Cool. That brings us to the conclusion of the opening half. Let's welcome the member of government to start for us the closing half, probably.
Sorry about that. Am I audible to everyone?
Yes, you're always audible.
Okay, some fool is playing with the server, so I really don't know if I'll be able to, let's say, follow everyone. So I think if I'm still audible for points of information, I think everyone should be free to unmute and ask. So don't feel shy, just unmute and ask. I think I am even unsure of what I'm going to say in this debate, but yeah, let's just go with that. I'm still audible. Is that correct?
Yes, you are. So,
All right. So I'm a bit confused right now, but I'll start my speech in three, two, one, go. I think opening half was a boring debate because all talks about how this is not going to be feasible because the union is not going to see it. I don't know since when Lowell last read the WDC manual. It says you should debate as if it were possible. So questions about the feasibility of a debate is not something opposition should be running in such a level of debate, I think, at this level. So I think all that material about UN and all countries opting out is actually rubbish in this debate, given that is not something we can discuss about. They should debate the merits and the merits of the motion actually. So they also talk about the economic impact. I feel this is laughable in this debate, given the countries that have abortion have not faced this situation. So there is no nuance sort of analysis coming from them that shows that there's everyone within these states are actually running to get abortion. That is actually rubbish because there's no explanation and logical reasoning to justify all that stuff could actually happen. So I think that case is also out of this debate, given I think human beings are still rational. We don't just abort because it exists. Therefore, countries will struggle maintaining abortion cases. I don't think that is essentially something that is useful. Then the other thing they also talk about was that abortion is let's say what murder at that case. I think there are two crucial like concession I think Lowell makes in his speech. It says there is no scientific consensus on whether individuals are actually human beings or not. That is already a concession that says if there is no agreement as to whether they are humans or not, so there shouldn't be the state that should be determining whether we should abort or not. It should be a decision that is left to the person that is actually carrying that fetus. That is what our case is actually going to prove. The second thing is that let's say, yeah, the fetus has no agency at this point, even if we are to agree that murder is something that is wrong, because it lacks no agency, and essentially means the person that is carrying it is losing their own agency to ensure that individuals is actually able to actually exist. So at that point, if the harm that is going to be inflicted on an individual that already has agency that is established, that means it becomes very legitimate for them to be able to actually abort or take away that life, like it's akin to sort of self-defense, given the harm that is going to be inflicted by the fetus would sort of outweigh essentially anything that maybe they would say whether or not it already has life. So I think the third thing I'll say on this, already under the status quo, there exists a lot of exception on regarding abortion. Let's say if you are raped, you are allowed to abort. If you maybe a product of incest, you are allowed to abort. That already takes out the case of opening opposition that says abortion is wrong, therefore it should not be used. If you're already giving concession to this and we're allowed to murder them at certain instances, then they do have to prove why, like certain instances like this that we're going to propose, it shouldn't be legal at all. So I think that is the case opposition has to deal with to show us essentially why at this scenario, why abortion shouldn't be legal at that instance, why it shouldn't be universally applied. So I'll take Lawal before I begin my extension. Shoot.
You honestly believe you will win this debate by not showing why this meets a universal metric?
Yeah, that is my case. That's where I'm getting to. I thought there was a sense of okay, I coming in. So essentially, they also maybe the last thing I'll engage on sovereignty, which I think is also laughable. Like all states have sovereignty, but we still do these things anyway. So why is it so? We still sanction state even if they have sovereign rights and all that. So I don't think that is a case opposition can win regarding abortion. So moving on to the extension, why it should be universally applied. So on the first metric that OO said, it says that there are a lot of disparities within state, therefore they should have the ability to determine their own rights. So I think this is uniquely why abortion should be a universal right, because we should link into other rights that already exist within status quo. The reason why they have rights for women to do this, rights for people to do this, rights to life, because it gives them the ability to exercise other rights. So with the absence of abortion, it simply means that individuals that to have children or kids that are unplanned for, it means the impact on their life is akin to them not having the ability to enjoy their life, not having the ability to be able to do other things. It means that a responsibility that comes to you as an individual when you're not prepared for, that is the situation where individuals that want to abort find themselves in. So
the outcome of having a baby and not aborting, it means you have a huge sort of responsibility to deal with. First, the 9 months that you have to spend. We don't think raising a baby, actually, that process itself is something that is cheap. So if opposition wants to say that it's going to be costly for the states to abort, we think it's laughable, because when you abort, the baby doesn't exist. When you don't abort, the baby exists. That means the application of responsibility actually amplifies. That means you put a lot of pressure on these individuals to be able to take care of someone they are not ready prepared for. That is why abortion exists in the very first place, because it ensures that individuals have the ability to be able to plan for a world where they're able to take care of this child, be able to make sure they have a meaningful existence. So if not having abortion means the quality of life is going to diminish for the mother, we think it should be a universal right that applies to all the states. It should not be limited to just simple state where individual state can sort of determine whether or not to do it. We think that leaves a lot of people at harm, like the countries that opening opposition talks about. So that is why it should be a universal right, because constitutional rights do exist to protect the weakest people within society, the minorities, the people that have the least sort of protection. That is what exists under the status quo, because we have very many oppressive states that ultimately constrain a lot of freedom for other individuals. We think the reason why there's a lot of compliance that would exist within status quo, because we see like things like sanctions they say don't work, because states have a unique incentives to stay within these international bodies, because you already have countries like the US, the UN, that already conservative and support this right, and the individuals that fund these institutions most. So it is very unclear why like most of these countries that opening opposition talks about become very significant, given they are the people that need this these organizations the most. So there is more incentives for them to stay, because they desire more support from them, because they are the weakest. That is what is happening to Afghanistan. That is what is happening to Saudi Arabia. They are very conservative state, but because of the desire to stay within this institution, they are lacking all those conservativeness, where you see women driving, women allowed to do all these things, even when religion itself says you shouldn't do it. But because of the desire to exist within international agencies, we see those states existing and not exiting. That is already a clear indication that these countries will not withdraw at any point, given abortion, as we already said, is something that is not clear. There is no overlapping consensus on why it necessarily should be this or that. That is why it should be a universal right that is given to all states, that we don't have very conservative states that ultimately or sort of constrain a lot of other people's ability to be able to have like a desirable life, because not having a baby is not something that is going to be cost effective for most of them. Proud to pause.
We thank the member of government for that fine speech. Let's welcome the member of opposition here.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah.
I am, right? Okay. That said, I will take a POI from opening government in my 5th minute. So when I reach my 5th minute, I'll be like, OG, do you have something to say? James Okuka, I would suggest you really say something. You really disappointed me in your opening speech. So it would help you to take a POI, to make a POI. All right. That said, I'm going to begin shortly. All right. So first, we need to understand or to properly contextualize today's discussion, right? To that, we need to first go down to the decision which informs the context of today's debate, right? In the Supreme Court case of Dobbs versus Jackson, in the lead judgment, this was the particular holding of the court, right? That whereas we believe abortion is a right which all women in our society ought to be entitled to, we do not think that it's a constitutional right enshrined within the Constitution of the US of America. That said, we believe that questions regarding abortion ought to be those which we leave up to the individuals of our particular society to resolve amongst themselves by discussing and then letting the legislators choose the course of action necessary for them to take in that particular regard. And we need to understand something unique which comes out of that decision, right? That whereas there are a lot of rights which exist, there is a fundamental distinction between what amounts to a constitutional right and what is merely a right of individuals, right? Constitutional rights are fundamentally different from basic rights in that each state has a mandate to ensure that everyone within the confines of a particular state has a right to access the same, and that any failure on the part of the state to make this accessible is a fundamental attack on the structures of that particular state because they have then failed their people, right? Other rights, on the other hand, merely exist as they are, but the state has no following obligation to ensure that that the same is protected, maybe through investing massive amounts of money into ensuring that the same is upheld, right? That is important because we need to understand the distinction between a constitutional right and a mere right, something which you fail to get a proper characterization of from the opening government. One reason why they stand rank first in today's debate. We need to understand that distinction first. Secondly, we need to understand what the motion demands of us, right? This house believes that motion. That means, in essence, it's supposed to be a discussion of what the principles in today's round actually are, right? We are supposed to engage in each other on what the core values of making abortion a constitutional right actually entail, or what not doing the same actually entail. The arguments we get from the opening half, which are about whether or not a life begins at conception or not, likely fall outside the construct or the constraint of what today's discussion actually demands of us. The debate is about whether or not that should be a constitutional right, irrespective of whether or not rights begin at a human life begins at conception or not, right? So we think the opening half does us a very big disservice in that regard, right? But then the third point of contextual analysis we need to engage on is, what does a universal right actually mean in principle, right? In principle, this means that there's a global consensus about that particular thing, that it ought to be something which the global community ought to take up as part of its own, something that they ought to protect at all material costs, irrespective of what a certain group of individuals think, right? For example, an analogy can be drawn between this and the right to not be beaten up, or to be the right to a fair trial, perhaps, right? A right to a fair trial. And like the perfect analogy would be that universally we accept that everyone has the right to fair trial, right? Arguing that abortion should have the same kind of protection is the burden on the government bench then is to show us why they think that abortion rights should be analogous to rights to fair hearings and fair trial. But lastly, by way of contextual analysis, what in essence do constitutional rights actually entail, right? In their most basic form. Panel, we need to understand that constitutional rights in the essence entail that there's going to be massive state investment specifically engineered toward protection of that particular right. That means, for the case of fair trial, setting up of tribunals to ensure that everyone is heard before they are actually condemned to either prison or fines or whatever it is that they are, right? In the context of abortion, that essentially means that the states will invest billions of shillings or of dollars directly spent at maybe building abortion clinics or things like that. That is what constitutional rights actually entail, that the government has a mandate to ensure that each and everyone within that particular state has access to them. In this case, they will set up clinics and train medical personnel to ensure that the same is briefly carried out by the states. Given this burden on states, is it then justifiable to make abortions a universal constitutional right for everyone within that particular context? Points of extension you get from us as the closing opposition. The first thing you need to understand, given the good context we give you, something which you like don't get from any other team in today's debate, we start to even rank fast before I get to my extension. But for the necessity of it, let us do this. One, is it possible to make abortions accessible to women without necessarily making them a constitutional right, right? That is the first thing we need to understand. One, what is the metric that we use for making something a constitutional right within a particular community? That there essentially has to be a general consensus amongst individuals within a particular geographical setting that this is something which is unique to us and which we need the state to ensure that they protect, right? The very nature of the contract between individuals and the state is that the state always follows what the directives or the mandate that the people gives them, right, to do, right? In this case, it means that if the people seem to agree that abortion should be a constitutional right, then the state has the mandate to enact the same as a constitutional right. Is that the case with abortion rights? We think not, right? Panel, by far and large, most of countries in the conservative world do not actually subscribe to abortion as a particular right, something you likely get from our opening, right? But we tell you that a simple analogy that you get from us as CO, right? An analogy can be drawn between abortion rights and gay rights, right? That whereas in many states, like for example in Uganda, gay rights aren't exactly enshrined in our constitution, right? Gay people have essentially freedom, like to do whatever it is that they want to do without the state necessarily clamping down on them and coming up to kill them, right? We think then that on a comparative, the state choosing to make gay rights a constitutional right within the conference of Uganda is the state forcing people within this particular country to have a blowback and fight against this particular state because people do not subscribe to this particular idea or notion. So doing that is the state making people turn against it, right? Yes, yes, OJ. Yes. Yes.
Okay, so we've already told you why we cannot leave it to the individual states to determine because they're oppressive. We've told you the desire to exist in the national
I get you.
affair.
I get you. The reason why we insist that it's not possible to make it a universal state is because of the differences between states, right? But right now I'm telling you that it's analogous to gay rights, that each state ought to take its own course. The problem with doing this within the confines of states like Uganda, where people do not support gay rights, is that there will be massive blowback against the government. So we tell you that laws ought to be a reflection of what the majority believe. In countries like Uganda, the laws ought to be a reflection of what a significant majority of the people believe. 80% of Ugandans do not believe in abortion as a right, right? So to that extent, we believe the state then has a mandate to enact policies which directly address the problems of individuals within these particular countries. Second piece of extension: what harms do we resolve from CG when we make abortions a right, but not necessarily a constitutional right? First, we tell you we ensure that A, there is no blowback from the general individuals, but two, we tell you we protect women's rights from side closing opposition. Why is that? Because we tell you A, they have access to the same without necessarily having to force the government to do what is not in the interest of that particular state. But then last and most importantly, perhaps we tell you there's an honest discussion amongst individuals within a particular state about what their rights ought to be, right? Because like we told you, like I began my speech, the US Supreme Court said that such discussions ought to be left to individuals to decide what they want. From side CO, we tell you that making it available or accessible to the people to have a discussion about the same and decide what they want means that there will be a more like localized development of this particular right without necessarily people having to fight back, especially when we reach a point where individuals are more willing to be accepting of this because of the discussion they have as a community as a whole, and they seem to think that it's within the best interest of that particular community to make the same legal. Thank you.
Just something small to note, guys. In case you don't know, or in case I didn't tell you at the beginning of the debate, I don't note down anything past the 15 minutes mark. So let's just try to be within that range. Yeah. Cool. We thank the member of opposition for that fine speech. Let's welcome the government whip to conclude the case from closing government specifically, but generally from the whole government bench. Here. Okay, guys. Where is the government whip? Member of government, are you here?
Yeah, I think it's in. Maybe it's just not audible. I see him as mute. He's unmuted.
Who is the government whip?
Hi guys, am I audible? I am?
Yes, you can start.
Cool. So guys, if you have a POI, just unmute yourself and ask. Just don't badger me though, right? And if I take one POI, then please don't bother asking other POIs. I'll be done. Paul, you'll kindly help me tell me when my time is done because I'm not exactly looking at the text space. All right, so just give me a second and I'll be good to go. All right, so let me first of all start by sort of clarifying on what Okedo tells you because I think some bit of it is clearly bullshit, right? So it sells us the idea that there are some sort of other rights, right? The idea that there are constitutional rights and there are other rights. And smartly, he doesn't tell you what other rights are. We're going to be telling to you why crucially we think that like that's a fallacy and it just sells to us that vague word, but he doesn't exactly substantiate. And I'm going to show you why crucially it's important that he does. And I actually dare Denise to go further and tell to us what other rights means. But before I go ahead with the case of CO, first to clarify and agree with Okello that really the debate that you get from the opening side is a bit more about whether what to do with abortion or not, and we think crucially that that is outside the debate, and those guys deserve to rank third and fourth in that particular regard. So what are the other things that you get from the case of Okello? The idea of constitutional rights give the obligation to states and all that, right? We think crucially that this underestimates what actually constitutional rights are. We think crucially constitutional rights exist in the first place to protect minorities, right? Understand that if individuals are a majority and they have interests in society, they control the big players and all those particular things, then these guys do not need constitutional rights at all. So we think that wherever you see constitutional rights, things like gay rights, as he was saying, things like women rights, these are actually rights that exist to protect minorities. And when you look at abortion rights, the individuals that are being protected, actually the minorities, right? The person or the girl who is actually fearful of their father, that if they knew that they had a pregnancy, then those guys will stop to sort of abort, will not be taken to school and all those particular things. We think that this is crucially a fundamental element that Okello does not exactly understand. And we think that if you actually understand that, then he would not be making the arguments that he actually makes, right? But also, the other thing that he tries to say now is to say that, we can still have a coexistence, right? We do not exactly need to make these rights constitutional, but we shall just keep their vague, not exactly highlighting what is the case, and that for some reason they still have to have the abortions going on. We think crucially that this is also a fallacy. Why is it a fallacy? Understand that the power of the state is such that everyone is following with what is going on, right? So if, for instance, you have a president who says or comes outrightly and says that we're not going to actually allow rights of guys that are aborting, then this has a ripple effect on the masses, right? The person the father that is going after a girl to sort of vindicate them and go against them, deny them school and all that stuff, will feel justified because the president has said a certain thing. So we think then that the step taken by a state has a ripple effect on actually what happens on the ground. And we think crucially then that that cannot actually be accepted. And we think that the coexistency that you actually sort of have from side C or like the assumption there does not really exist because of this particular ripple effect. Yeah. But crucially, what do you get from side CG, right? We told you that firstly, we think these rights should be constitutional because we think, and universal, that because we think there already exist other rights that are universal and are related to this whole element of constitution of abortion, right? That's why this talks about things like right to life, right? The fact that the right to life is linked to the right to livelihood, and that if any individual is not able or his livelihood, or her livelihood is impeded by the fact that they have to bear a child and they have to look after that child, and we think crucially, then that becomes something that makes it universal because while states while like guys might argue that this is not a universal thing, I'll take you level, but just hold on. We think that crucially states have already recognized that these other rights are universal, and we think the extent that there's that particular kind of linkage, then we think that this is something that is justified, right? But also really the other thing that we argue that I've already highlighted is the idea that constitutional rights exist to sort of protect vulnerable individuals, right? So to the extent that in this particular case we're protecting vulnerable people, then we think crucially that we have a justification and that we are going with that. Lowell.
Please engage us on the issue of plausibility, especially majority consensus.
I was coming to that. I was coming to that. Hold your fire. I was coming to that, right? So I think we're already clear with what exactly we stand. So let me try to engage Lowell's arguments, even though they are absurd, as Vincent has already highlighted. Understand, first of all, that this debate is not about the practicals, right? The idea is, should we make abortion rights universal and all that? In his attempt to answer these particular questions, Lowell talks about the idea of consensus. Now, I think Lowell does not exactly understand how we actually reach at the idea of rights. Understand that people do not sort of dream about rights. We think that, for instance, before rights come about, you have things like awareness, right? So the first question for us to answer, which is the question that this debate is trying to answer, is should we make that right universal? Should we make it constitutional? We think that after achieving that, then we can go about things like awareness and all those particular things. And we think that at the end of the day, we can achieve that. So we think that those arguments do not exactly stand, that some states are not already buying into these particular things because we think that's usually how rights actually work, right? So people do not actually have like this resistance and everything because they do not know in the first place. So once we have determined, then we can go about the other things that Lowell seems to be so much interested in, right? That also answers the idea of plausibility and how states are going to pull away from the international community, etc, etc. So I think Lowell, you sort of answered there, right? But also the idea he talks about is the idea of economics, right? The fact that these individuals will have to spend a lot of money and all those particular things. We think crucially, this again misses the fact that first of all, human beings are rational, right? But also secondly, to say that understand that even guys that abort actually suffer, right? Understand that, for instance, their health might be at risk, right? And that these guys are going to go through continuous treatment, etc. So we think that they do not exactly take out abortion because they want to, but they they take it because, like, you know, it has come up and it's a last resort and those particular things. So we think that to the extent that there are these impediments, then this guarantees that they would not have this sort of floodgates that Dawell wants to assume. But the idea that I want to talk about is the idea that comes from Okello, right? The idea that governments are now going to have an obligation to spend money and all those particular things. We think crucially, to the extent that I've already showed you that this right is universal, but also secondly, is looking at protecting the rights of vulnerable individuals, we think crucially this is justified because we think that rights sort of supersede or like come before these whole things of course, etc. Unless like now Okello and Denise would like to overturn the whole instance of constitutionalism, etc. I think my time is done.
The speaker just went off. He had like 15 seconds on table. It's cool. Okay, we thank the government whip for that fine speech. That's if he doesn't have anything else to say. Let's welcome the opposition whip to conclude the case. So the closing opposition and the entire opposition in general. Yeah.
Okay, so am I audible? Please just confirm I'm audible. Okay, please, anyone to tell me if I'm audible?
Yes, you are.
3, 2, 1, go. Panel. Notice that this debate was entirely about two things, and the team that wins from government is the team that shows you whether it should be a universal constitutional right, and the team that wins from opposition is the one that tells you whether it should have been an individual right for the state or whether it should be a universal state. So why do we win against OG? Notice that OG, number one, was supposed to come and tell you who is going to determine or who is going to decide whether the life of another is being affected, right? But secondly, why those two lives are over difference, and thirdly, how are they going to assist the other states that have differences contextually that are liberal and conservative in that society, right? Those are the three things they fail to do in this debate, right? They go ahead and argue that things such as freedom should necessarily be observed, right? But firstly, they fail to recognize and appreciate that the context of which the countries exist universally are totally different. States have different beliefs. States have different beliefs of which they believe in, right? So the point in time that you're going to have such contradicting things that are existing in such a society, then you cannot accept freedom at a point in time that it is infringing on the rights or on the legitimacy of various individuals. Vincent, I'll take you later. But secondly, we think that we need to recognize the nature of our rights that exist in different sovereign states, right? Notice that what exists in different, what makes up the laws and the rights, it is what the majority of the people believe in, like Fortunate tells you, right? They exist as a form of protection, but secondly, the laws in that society or in that country necessarily reflect what the majority believe in those various states, right? At a point in time that you want to make it universal, dependent or whether independent of what these states believe in, then they ought to lose this debate, right? So what do we tell you? We tell you from our side, CJ, I'm going to engage you later. First, wait. So we tell you from our side, we think that you can only leave it to the state, and I'm going to justify to you on
three reasons why we think that this should be left to the states, right? One, we think that they are in better position to focus on the needs of their citizens, or secondly, they are in better position to implement such. Why? We think at a point in time that you bring a law or an universal right that is not accepted by such societies, like Fortunate tells you about how abortion is illegal in some countries. They tell you that, one, we think that what you get on the side of these governments is backlash. Why? Because the laws or the rights you're trying to bring do not reflect in what the majority believe in. And panel, notice that this is distinct from our opening, which argues shitty feasibility, which already exists in the context, right? So we go on and tell you that, firstly, they're going to face a problem of policy alignment and policy implementation at a point in time that citizens are not going to follow these rights or are not going to follow these laws that are being put in place, not necessarily by the state, right? What that necessarily means is that the citizens are not responsive, they're not going to be sensitive to these laws, but also that they're not understanding what the state is going, they do not relate to it, right? But thirdly, we think we need to also understand that even in the worst case scenarios that these individuals go on and get like all these rights and decide to abort, one, in a society that the majority do not believe in abortion, one, they're going to face stigmatization, but secondly, we think that the harms that do exist on both sides are more detrimental, right?
Right.
I'm going to take you. I said I'll take you is in the text space. I'll take you. And preferably I'll take James and Notre. So we go on and tell you that such states, people are going to feel like have trust and have confidence in that government rather than when you make it a universal right. I'll take James.
Even in the vast majority of instances, your problem is money. We can contract private investors. What do you say about that? But secondly, abortion doesn't stigmatize a person who doesn't carry out. So your case is, you literally don't have an extension.
Well, okay, sorry, it's because you don't have a case that you do not recognize the extension. But let's go on. We tell you that, one, you need to also understand at a point in time where the majority are coming from and what makes up society. Society is necessarily made up of principles and values that reflect what the majority believe in, right? What that means is that, for example, if you have aborted in society that does not believe in abortion or does not have a principle of abortion, then necessarily what you're going to get from society is stigmatization, right? But we think that this should not be a constitutional right, and that is not the debate. The debate necessarily, Vincent, I will not take you. The debate necessarily lies whether it should be an individual state thing or whether it should be a universal right thing, right? But we tell you justification for the states, why the states are in best position, because they address the needs of the people. But secondly, these people have like more trust and more responsiveness to their governments rather than a universal right declaration. But thirdly, we need to appreciate the difference that exists within different states, right? At a point in time that this it is made a universal right, and some countries that are conservative do not believe into this. For engagement, I'll take you Annoyed CG. I'll take you Vincent.
Okay, we believe that the majority of white people didn't believe that the minority black people deserved rights, but they gave them rights anyways. Where does your case stand in this
Exactly.
debate?
That is why the blacks in the US are still facing discrimination, because the majority of the people did not believe they needed the rights and they still gave them to them. They still face discrimination and all the problems that are mattering in the vast majority in that case. And that is exactly what I'm trying to show to you. At a point in time that you allow this to happen because you believe the liberal states believe in this, at the end of it all, these states are going to face backlash from their people. And this is necessarily going to affect the governments in the vast majority because they face a problem on policy alignment and policy implementation. And that's where we come in to take away your case where you talk about oppressive regimes. When you talk about oppressive regime, panel notice that in every context, every government needs capitalism, or it is capitalistic in nature because it needs support for the next regime or something, right? Even at a point in time that it is oppressive, at a point in time that it has that pressure, it is going to bring into place what the vast majority of the people believe in that country. So we think that even when you bring about the oppressiveness, the whole thing of that, we think we do not believe in it, and they still go ahead to bring about these rights that are going to favor the people because they want the next buy-in, right? But thirdly, why do we rank above our opening? Notice that our opening comes to argue about feasibility and all these things, which Vincent already tells you that they do exist and we do not need to argue about that, and that was very shitty about the UN and everything, right? So OG, we tell you three things we rank above OG. They fail to show us why this freedom is important, because even we think that when governments, in countries where abortion is not an option, governments do bring into place mechanisms to prevent such unwanted pregnancies. They provide the condoms and they go ahead and they provide this education and all that. They go ahead to invest to prevent the abortion, right? So we think that these people, by the time they go in, they have the full autonomy of they have considered. So they needed to show us why it is still important and go ahead and show us that they have to bring about how these states are all going to bring it about noticing their differences, right? So why we rank about CG comes and tells you that they want to protect like the weakest people in society and all that. We tell you that the weakest people in society are protected when the vast majority vote is taken, right? Because they do not get to face the discrimination or the marginalization that does exist. So why do we win this debate? We win this debate why? We tell you that one, we think that the states are justified to do this because they have the incentive to make sure that the citizens buy into what they have, right? That means that they're going to be more trustworthy. The policy implementation and alignation is going to be brought into place, right? But secondly, you do not get backlash from countries that have differences, that are conservative and liberal, never been proud to oppose.
Okay. Guys. Okay. Let me just first. So thank you guys for that fine debate. It was a wonderful one. Please do not leave. Let me just inquire whether this is an open round or a closed round. If it's an open round, you'll have to give me some good time so that I also harmonize. Other than that, just for the next purposes, please keep the text area explicitly professional. Like, let it just be for POIs, for heaven's sake. Cool.
Thank you for the debate, opposition and CG. Like, this is shaking hands. Thanks for the debate.
But don't just send those things and I think they're arguing.
Never have I never been so unproud to propose such a motion. Like, wow.
It's lovely how all closing teams really said the opening half was shitty. Like, you all just decided to say let's gang up on one another.
And they didn't provide experience, imagine, especially CEO.
You guys just don't want to be civil, right? Like, it's very
Yo, closing teams are not your friends. Yeah?
Yo, next time we have rooms like this with judges here.
Yeah, I think we.
See, this is why closing teams don't win worlds, because you people.
Okay, I hear it's an open round, so just call your teammates back. Let me just do something small. Hope I'm audible for everyone. Let me just.
Yes, you are.
Okay, so I'm just going to give you guys rankings and do the justification. Then, in case anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask later on. Yeah. Okay, let me just do
Yeah,
something
you
small.
tell Titi. First, she has to finish. Once she's done, yeah.
Maria, please mute.
You tell.
Oh, thanks. Okay. Okay, so hello everyone. I hope all teams are represented. I see CO here, I see OG here, CG here. Please, Peria. Yeah, Peria is okay. So if all of you are okay with me proceeding, even when your partner is not here, please just indicate in the text area with your team, like or C or any. Let's do it ASAP. Indicating means you consent to me proceeding even when your teammate is not around. Oh, okay. Okay. So my case was with all. Cool. So let's proceed. So essentially, the motion as this House believes that abortion should be universal constitutional right. I believe that's the motion everyone was debating. Yeah. Okay. So this is how my OA is going to proceed. I'm going to give you like the general feedback. Then I'll give you the rankings as the last thing because I know this is UG, so you need to know the rankings later. So generally, I think this debate, I won't say that it was a great debate because it had scenarios where it was below average and scenarios where it was above average. So regardless, we just proceeded with whatever everyone, rather I just proceeded with whatever everyone wrote rather than putting it on one specific person that I have not done this. So according to how the debate went, this is how it was. So okay, I'm being tempted to say the rankings. Let me just say this. Okay. Let me start from the opening half, then I come to closing half. Yeah. I'll be doing a comparison on each. So let me first do OG or comparison. So essentially, what we get from opening government is that they say abortion is more of like termination of a pregnancy. Secondly, they say it's more of like constitutional right. It's more of like a decision that is entirely decided like by the state. So the state still has the capacity to decide that it still proceeds. Rather, that's a universal right. But the third thing they talk about is on like where their case comes in. First thing they talk about is on like freedom and so on and so forth. The second thing is on that literally abortion is not necessarily taking away the life of someone who is living. Why? Because primarily that thing is not alive. Third thing is on the process by which abortion happens or the time period by which abortion happens. Then the fourth thing is on like consequences, and the other things are like just a backup of those four core things. Opposition talks about firstly the plausibility of it being a universal constitutional right. Secondly, how it's highly controversial. Thirdly, how it affects the economy and sovereignty, consequences, and sustainability. So, a way up on opening half alone before we bring in the closing. Firstly, I think that opening government, by means of them saying that it provides for some form of freedom, and their basis of analysis was that for their side, the freedom is much more better compared to the other side of the house. Why? Because they think you're literally infringing on the freedom of the other side. But secondly, they also analyze in terms of like, it then means you do not have any form of consistency, but also it means that it's more of like civil disobedience still will proceed on their side. So that means it's harmful for individuals. The response I get to this from opposition in terms of like this specific point was more of like the freedom that individuals have from that specific side is more of like limited freedom. I needed a comparison on, okay, if it's limited freedom, then what comparative do you have on your side? Because what the other side is saying is that for yours will have some form of like civil disobedience and also get some form of inconsistency. So on that specific point, like it still goes back to opening government. Second thing, on the question of like abortion doesn't necessarily mean that you're taking a life. And the analysis to this was that it is not necessarily like there is no there is no legal right that the thing that is being aborted has a life. What opposition says is that it is not necessarily plausible to actually know. Why? Because you can't implement it in many states like in Asia and so on and so forth. Okay, I think that questioning plausibility in a motion that this house believes that abortion should be a universal constitutional right is not necessarily something that is required, because they already assume that everything can still proceed. Now the debate then starts on like what are the benefits that come out of it coming into play, or the harms that come when it's not into play. So everything questioning plausibility was not in any way, I couldn't like credit it unless maybe this was like a motion that was more of like a policy. But this motion was one that required like more of a comparison. That thing then is on the question of consequences, where OG says that the consequences are much more dire when you literally do not make it a universal right. Why? Because individual, like you do not have the capacity to control one's urge to have sexual intimacy. Secondly, that one might literally might not have the capacity to take care of the child, and the mere fact that they do not have the capacity to take care of the child, so it's better when you make it a universal right so that they literally have accessibility to this. That's to say, it is much more cheaper for those individuals. And I think this is where they also try to make the analysis that individuals are rational, and the mere fact that they are rational, they get to understand that we think that since it will be expensive in future, it's better if we do it now and we proceed. The response to this explicitly, I do not necessarily like get it, but I think the response indirectly was more of like in terms of like the economics, where opening opposition talks about economics. They say that it will be expensive on the side of government. Why? Because abortion primarily requires individuals to have like huge funds for you to proceed with it. But also the post care of abortion literally makes it much more harder for individuals. So I needed like a way in on okay, so if it becomes expensive, so what then is the way forward? Like, because the other side is saying that the consequences, like on their side, are much more cheaper compared to your side. For you, saying, who is that? Cool. Let me just proceed. Okay, so for you guys, you're saying that it is much more expensive on the other side. Like, I needed a comparison specifically on how you think that it is expensive on the other side and it's cheaper on your side, like how it becomes better on your side. I didn't get that comparative. I think the thing that was lacking largely in opening up was comparison between the two sides. Both opening government and opening opposition are falling short on that. Take for instance on the point of opening opposition of sovereignty, then the point of consequences and sustainability. I think opening government could have done better in form of like considering all these things coming up in the debate or later on in the debate. But regardless, we just proceed with how it works. So like the issue of sovereignty, consequences, and sustainability came in an extension that was why they should literally leave it for the countries to actually proceed with it not being a universal, like a universally constitutional right, where they analyze that there'll be no form of like backlash since countries will decide whether to proceed or not to proceed. Then the consequences are like countries buyout of international bodies, because opening opposition assumes that the implementer is something like UN or an international body. Yeah. So at the point where they assume that is the case, so like we proceed with the debate as if it happens in that specific scenario. So in the opening half, I found it much more compelling, rather much more rhetoric, to credit opening government above opening opposition. So let's move to the closing half. So the comparison between closing government and closing opposition. Firstly, you need to understand that closing government, primarily what they do is firstly they provide an analysis more of like individuals and what literally entails individuals, where they say, and this was like in comparison of the person who literally has like the fetus, where they say that that person is the one who literally suffers or is the one who undergoes all the hardships that exist, and they make a lot of put a lot of words there. But secondly, they also say that these are like unwanted things that are within that specific person. So when you provide for it to actually proceed, it means that you're compromising the right to that specific person's life, that's to say, in form of like the agency that person has, and the mere fact that that person literally is compromising themselves for something they do not know, then literally it's harmful. So like that individual analysis makes me then to understand why then it is necessary for them to actually have that mandate. But still they do not first link it back to like why then it should be a universally constitutional right. I think I get it from the second part where they then talk about how it incentivizes implementation and adaptation by other individuals or by other states in form of like they desire to actually still obtain funding from those specific states. The analysis comes in form of like they say that what their side does is that they provide for some form of like curtailment or the elimination of conservatism of individuals. So the analysis then plays into like the individualistic one, where they say that we think that when you literally have this, it then means that individuals will be much more better and they'll have some form of like self-actualization that proceeds for them. But the second thing, and I think this goes untampered with in the closing up, is on where they talk about like the accessibility to funds. That the mere fact that you make it a universal constitutional right, then it means that it is much more easier for you to get any form of like assistance from any agencies that you would require. So to that extent, CO comes and first makes a clarity and I think this was more of like a contextual extension where they say it was more of like a distinction between what entails constitutional rights, but secondly, what distinguishes other rights from constitutional rights. Their extension is explicitly on that. So firstly, they say constitutional rights are those that are literally emphasized by the state. That makes it different from the other states. And that means it plays in terms of like the other things that they say, where they say that for something to be a constitutional right, it means that the state has to fund it, like invest in it a lot compared to the others. But secondly, they say they try to bring the analysis that their opening brings of how you make something a constitutional right. But for them, they go further and they say, because they say it's by consensus, but they go further and they say that once there is no consensus, it means that it means that in states or in specific states, it means that you will not have it as a constitutional right. So what this does is that it provides like for some form of backlash or blowback that comes back on individuals, and the mere fact that it comes back, it affects them. The second thing they talk about is on how it harms, like they resolve the harms on their side. Though I think like this was internalized. The first thing they say is on how their side like prevents blowback. Yes, you're saying that you prevent blowbacks, but like how exactly? Because I also put a question mark like, so how do you do it and what are the impacts that come out of it? Like I do not get an analysis from that. But secondly, they also talk about things like of human rights, like rather women's rights preserved on their side. Yes, if you're saying women's rights are preserved on your side, weigh it in comparison with the other side, because the other side is more of like on the individual nature of like women, like they suffer a lot, they have these unwanted things. So if they are unwanted, so they need to terminate them. You're saying you protect their rights. What if their right is that they want to terminate it? Do you still protect that? Like I needed a comparison directly in terms of that. So like I didn't get it from CO, so I still credited CG above CO. So let me do bench comparison. First, let me do opening government. So CG OG comparison. Essentially, what OG says is not like far too different from what CG says. But the difference is that CG, what they do is more of like an analytical extension, because realize that them talking about like how women suffer and so on and so forth, it's form of like what OG tries to say, but like they bring it in a different context in form of like an analysis that is much more easier. The first thing they say, like comparison, yeah. So the first thing they say is that we still think that on their side, or for them on their side, that's CG, that the mere fact that their side ensures that there is some form of like awareness for individuals, because like this, I think it came in form of like a response to all, that there is some form of awareness that exists before like anything is implemented. It means you credit that specific thing. So it still means like in case the question was about applicability, still you would credit it. I do not get any form of like response to this specific point from OG to OO. But secondly, I think CG's emphasis was more of like constitutional rights exist primarily to protect more of the individuals who are vulnerable. That's to say the minorities. So what Oji was saying was more of like a general idea rather than one that is squeezed down to only one. So CG just does a tactical thing of like looking at the specific individuals in terms of like the stakeholders who are primarily affected by this, and that's like what distinguishes their extension, and they make it an analytical extension from their opening. So that's why like I created CG above OG. So let me do like COOO. Why do I credit one above the other? Firstly, okay, Zimbabwe superstar, you can relax. So firstly, is on the question of like what's the clarity that was lacking in the entire debate. CO brings a clarity that is distinct from OO. The first clarity is on the constitutional rights, like what makes something to be a constitutional right and what doesn't. Okay, like their opening says it, but like for them, they provide something that is unique in form of like an extension to it. But the second thing, though it was internalized, I still think it stands independently and it still makes them like rank above their opening because on the outside that the mere fact that these constitutional rights like require massive investment, so it means that the state will literally be affected in one or another. So like I still think it plays into like what trying to say, but theirs comes in with a different thing. But mere fact it comes with a different thing. It means like I just have to credit it for them above their opening. The reason why their opening does not create above like them specifically is because firstly, opening opposition was largely lacking because I think they assumed that this debate was more like we should question the applicability, yet it's not necessarily about that. It's about questioning like the nuance that you get from something prevailing or not prevailing. So at the point where they literally do that, like it was okay, I am the one giving the OA. I don't know why you're reacting well. Okay, you'll have sessions of asking me questions and I'll justify for it. So like at the point where like CO already distinguishes themselves from like OO, like I already created them. In case you want a detailed feedback, I can give it to you later on. I can give it to you now because like we are on limited time. Okay. So let me do like the long diagonal OGCO. Firstly, OG's matter primarily was on the four things I told you. But the other thing was that they also had something like of how their side provides for like some form of like accountability that individuals are incentivized to literally have protected sex and some form of like self-actualization. CO, despite the clarity they provide, they do not provide us with a nuance that is directly comparative to OG. So at the point where they do not provide us with a nuance that is directly comparative to OG, like I couldn't trade them above OG. But secondly, the interaction that they give to OG. Firstly, they try to analyze why freedom is not important, but like the analysis is not like entirely conclusive because OG already makes an analysis that these individuals require that freedom, and the mere fact that they require it, it's necessary. What CO does, they do not even show us like how they are side still because OG's analysis was based on like how rights exist as a form of like protection. They say rights exist as a form of protection, but now that's the problem is that that is like general. What CG and OG are trying to say is that yes, rights exist as a form of protection, but they are saying that make it a make this abortion a universal like a universal constitutional right. I think the nuance that was required from CO was supposed to be in form of like bias that shows why that life when like why on their side when it's in form of a protection it wouldn't literally prevail on their side when it's not in that specific context. So like in that diagonal I give it to OG above CG. I already did CGCO. Rather, yeah, I already did CGCO. So let me do OOCG. So why does CG rank above? Or meanwhile, I should be typing. So actually, hold on. So why does OO and CG? How do they play out? Essentially, the nuance that you get from OO was on things of like sovereign consequences, sustainability, economics, plausibility. Then it was also on something like how controversial agencies are, specifically like the UN. So, what does CG do? The first thing is that like they also acknowledge the fact that this debate has to be created like on the merits, not necessarily on plausibility. Yes, that is just like one of the four instances. Now let me bring in the others. The second thing is they say that humans are rational. So it means when they say humans are rational, it means that anything you say in form of like seriously, Lowell, seriously. This is messed up.
Please go on. Some of us are listening.
Okay. Let me just, in case you have any issue with me, I think feedback forms are there for a reason. You can just fill it in there in case you're dissatisfied with the OR. But also, you can still approach me. Also, if you want, I can just give you my address. You come and try your luck with me. Okay. Okay, the last part wasn't necessary. So let me proceed like to OO, CG comparison. So, firstly, on the question of like how OO says that humans are rational. So once OO says humans are rational, that plays into like all the other things that CG rather once CG says that humans are rational, it plays into the other things that OO tries to say. That's to say, like things like their agency is highly controversial, so you can never know what is right and what is not right. So that means since you can't know, the human beings themselves, or the people who are literally trying to implement it, I don't know who is removing people, other people are trying to implement it, already know what they want and they can still proceed with it. So like that still talks about like individuals' choice in and of itself, but indirectly. I think that caters for that point that OO tries to talk about. But the second thing then that uh that CG says in response to this was on like the analysis on agents where they say that this person is doing it for themselves. That's to say, it's more of like self-defense for them, and the mere fact that it's self-defense, it means that anything you say like it will be expensive for them, post and prior, is not in any way credited. Because once they make that analysis, like it already caters for the part of economics that what tries to bring in. But not only that, it also caters for the question of backlash, where OO tries to say that their side is more sustainable because there is literally no backlash when countries don't proceed. I think the mere fact that they talk about the agency, that's CG, it already caters for okay. So since individuals feel like they are doing this for self-defense, it means that once you deprive them of that, you literally still have backlash. So the no backlash you're talking about still will prevail. So like I still credited that for CG above OO. Third thing then is on the question of what is it? Okay, on the question of sovereignty, where CG says sovereignty exists everywhere, and the mere fact that sovereignty exists everywhere, it should not be like a basis for you not to provide it as a universal constitutional right. I don't credit CG for this. Why? Because the sovereignty that OO talks about was more of like countries should have that full autonomy to decide what they want and what they do not want. So the question then becomes a weighing of that autonomy versus the nuance that you get in form of like the individual analysis that CG provides, because CG's extension was basically on that specific context. So why I credited their analysis compared to the sovereignty of countries is because within the states, individuals exist, yes. I needed in case opposition was to take this on that specific merit, I needed like a comparison that shows why, despite individuals, like let's say they desire that right to life, but also they do not want these pregnancies, or the mothers do not want to suffer, they still want something to still prevail in terms of like not abortion or it not being a constitutional right. I still need an analysis that comparatively distinguishes the opposition stance from the closing government stance. I didn't get it from opening opposition in that specific context, but I'm not saying like they should have brought it like later on, but it could have come like in form of a preemptive that probably before it comes. Other than that, that's why like I created CG above OO. So which one haven't I done? I've done OGC or CO. Who is left? OGCG done or done. Yeah. So I think that's like generally the whole of it. So I credited OG below CG, OO below, rather CO above OO, and yeah, those are the rankings, and the rankings are there. Let me just type it. Okay, in case anyone has a question, please feel free to ask. Let's make it quick because I have to make it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
All right. So I just want to like understand the OGCG comparison. So I think based on what I got from your feedback, like you're saying, so it was the idea that CG said implicitly that they are protecting people. Because I think that was the thing you said, because you said that our case inherently was like general, but CG says they are protecting. So because they are saying they're protecting was necessarily why you ranked them. I just wanted to run it by you. Because I think necessarily in the case I am represented, it wasn't, we didn't, I don't know if you wanted us to say we are protecting, but it was implicit that we are necessarily protecting like people's rights to abortion. That's why when I explained the idea on freedom, I said the repercussion is social disobedience because people are not necessarily getting their rights. But the second thing was that you talked about how CG had this response to OO, and then like we didn't have a solid response to OO. I just want to know, like, you weighed us on that particular comparison of responses to OO, or necessarily like based on what you said.
Okay. Any other questions from OG?
Oh yeah. So the other thing is this. So the thing is, as much as CG had that, I was going to ask. I mean, we had like about three to four like levels we talked about, and based on like what you said. So I was like wondering, like, even based on what we said, and like, why was that one contribution significant enough to topple everything we said? Yet most of the stuff they said were kind of symmetric to what we said. So like, I just want to know like why that specific thing toppled above the idea of freedom you get from us, above the idea of the cost benefit we tell you that you get from us, above the idea on how being able to manage consequences is a better alternative for states. Yeah, I just want to know that. Those are the only questions I have.
Okay. So let me just respond to the first thing. I think you are asking about responses. Okay, I didn't credit necessarily CG above OG because of like the responses. No, it was partially because of responses, and partially because of the arguments, and partially because of the analysis. So let me like do the other two things partially, because I think that's where